Hola, welcome to Respiratory System 1. This is an anatomy overview. So, if you watched the previous podcast introduction, you've seen this cartoon. But now I'm going to use this cartoon to show you one zone of the two major zones of the respiratory system. So the two major zones are the conducting zone of the respiratory tree and the respiratory zone of the respiratory tree. So those are key terms that should work hard to not be confused by. So in the conducting zone of the respiratory tree, what that means is, or the reason they call it a conducting zone is because it's conducting air down to the level of the alveoli. So the conducting zone then would consist of air going into the nasal cavity, through the pharynx or throat, through the larynx or voice box into the trachea, and then the trachea branches into right and left primary bronchi. Those primary bronchi branch into secondary and tertiary bronchi, and then after the tertiary bronchi, the diameter of the tube is so small that you call it a bronchiole. If you go out to the end of the bronchiole or bronchiolar tree, you'll see a terminal bronchiole. We'll look at that in a second. The terminal bronchiole is the end of the conducting zone. So the conducting zone begins in the nasal cavity and ends at the terminal bronchiole. Those are the parts of the respiratory tree where air is conducted through but not exchanged. Air is exchanged, in other words, oxygen and carbon dioxide are exchanged within the respiratory zone of the respiratory tree. So this is the cartoon of the respiratory zone. So this time you don't have to pay attention to the blood vessels, but look at the tube part. So you see where it says terminal bronchiole, that's the end of the conducting airway. And then as you go further out in the respiratory tree towards the alveoli, the terminal bronchiole become respiratory bronchioles, and they're not labeled on this cartoon, but you know you're a respiratory bronchiole when you have little outpouchings of alveoli, because that's where you can actually exchange, if there's a capillary present in the respiratory bronchiole, you can exchange oxygen and CO2. So in other words, just distal to the terminal bronchiole is a respiratory bronchiole, and a respiratory bronchiole, like I said, has little outpouchings of alveoli and capillaries, and that's where you can do exchange. So that's a major overview of the conducting zone of the respiratory tree and the respiratory zone of the respiratory tree. So let's look at a little bit more detail in the conducting zone of the respiratory tree. All those passages that carry air but do not do gas exchange. So like I told you in the previous slide, in the conducting zone you're just conducting air out to the respiratory zone, which is actually where you can do gas exchange. In this space of the conducting zone, they call it dead air space, and they call it dead air space because the air in this space is not able to allow for diffusion of oxygen and CO2. So there's no ability for those gases to be exchanged between blood and the respiratory tree. Therefore, it's a dead zone. So the entire conducting zone contains dead air space. So like I said, if you look at the cartoon, we start with the nose. It's also called the nares, or aka the nostrils. Air comes in through there, goes into the nasal cavity, and then you see those kind of within the nasal cavity in this cartoon. You can see those sort of hills and valleys. That's the conchi meatai system, and that's an important system that helps make the air in your nasal cavity become turbulent, so the air can sort of turbulate within the nasal cavity, and then moisture can be added to that air, and heat can be added to that air that's going down, that's destined to go out to the respiratory tree. And I said from the nasal cavity, you go to the pharynx, the larynx, the trachea. The bronchi, remember there's a primary, secondary, and tertiary bronchi, and then you go to the level of the bronchioles, and at the very end of the conducting zone you have the terminal bronchioles, and then at the beginning of the respiratory zone the terminal bronchioles morph into the respiratory bronchioles. And remember, you know you're in a respiratory bronchiole because you have little outpouchings of alveoli and capillary where you can actually do gas exchange. The conducting zone, they say that it's a conduit for air, a rigid conduit for air, because in the beginning of the respiratory tree you have a lot of cartilage, but the cartilage kind of diminishes, and then you, to hold the respiratory tree lumens open, you have a lot of smooth muscle as you get deeper and deeper into the respiratory tree. And I told you that this system, this conducting zone system, is preparing the air to get out to the alveoli where you can do gas exchange. So in the conducting zone, you're purifying the air that you breathe in, you're humidifying it, so you're adding water vapor to it, and you're also warming it. So this is a cartoon. Well, it's not really a cartoon, it's a photograph. What they did is this is human respiratory tree, and they poured some resin out into the trachea, and then the resin hardened, and they broke away the actual tissue, and what was left was this cast. And it shows the trachea, in the middle is the trachea, and the trachea branches in the right and left pulmonary bronchi, and then those bronchi, you can see where they branch, those are secondary bronchi, and where the secondary branch again, then you're in a tertiary bronchi. And the colored parts are bronchopulmonary segments that are important in surgery. So there's connective tissue that kind of delineates these colored portions of the respiratory tree, so surgeons know where to cut, or they know that if you have a tumor in one of these sections, like the red section on the right side, that they can just cut within that connective tissue, enclosing that red area, and not cut into the other parts of the lung. So this is all conducting zone, but in this model you just go out to the level of the tertiary bronchi. The bronchioles and the alveoli, they were too thin to hold the resin in this cast, so you can't see the bronchioles. You can't see the bronchioles or the terminal bronchioles or the respiratory bronchioles or the alveoli in this cast. So now if you look at the bottom of the cartoon, and on the left-hand side you see, again, the purple thing is the lung, and then the blue tubes are the bronchi. Then you can see as the respiratory tree branches and branches, you get out to the level of the respiratory bronchioles. And then if you look on the right-hand side of the cartoon, you can see a terminal bronchiole is labeled, and it's a terminal bronchiole because it doesn't have any outpouchings of alveoli. And then the terminal bronchiole morphs into the respiratory bronchiole, and you know you're in a respiratory bronchiole because you see the alveoli. So the respiratory zone then are the most proximal, or the end branches of the entire respiratory tree. That's where you do gas exchange between the alveoli and the alveolar capillaries. Respiratory bronchioles, that's the beginning of the respiratory zone, and that's where you can start doing gas exchange. You go from a respiratory bronchiole into an alveolar duct, and then you terminate in an alveolar sac. So the way you can tell the difference is respiratory bronchioles, you've got, you know, just some outpouchings of alveoli. When you're in an alveolar duct, those alveoli get thicker and thicker, and then when you're at the very distal ends of the respiratory tree, you can see an alveolar sac, which is just a whole lot of alveoli. And then this is a scanning electron micrograph of alveoli in the top left, terminal bronchioles in the upper right, and then respiratory bronchioles in the lower left. And then on the right is just an alveolus.